Welcome, everybody, to our debate, Capitalism and COVID. I'm really looking forward to it. We've got three fantastic speakers. This pandemic has led to calls for a radical overhaul of capitalism. The sight of governments spending hundreds of billions of pounds or dollars or euros on interventions has made ideas like a universal basic income look more plausible to many. But is radical change deliverable? And would it work for the benefit of all? Should we see the global response to the pandemic as evidence that massive government intervention is the solution to society's inequalities, or is this fantasy, and that the huge interventions will instead lead to a painful hangover, hard times for everyone, and less freedom and dynamism in our societies? We do have three amazing guests. Paul Krugman is widely regarded as one of the most important economists in the world. He won the Nobel Prize in 2008. He's a distinguished professor at City University of New York and an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Deirdre McCloskey is a distinguished professor emerita of economics and of history at the University of Illinois. She's written 24 books, some of which have been incredibly influential. They're all great, but some of which have been incredibly influential in changing people's views about economic history and development. And she's well known for her 2019 book, Why Liberalism Works. Grace Blakeley is an economic journalist for The New Statesman. In her first book, Stolen, Grace argues that democratic socialism is urgently needed to resolve mounting inequality and the domination of financial capital. So, we're going to start with this. Should we see the global response to the pandemic as evidence that massive government intervention is the solution to society's inequalities? Over to you, Paul.
Okay. So, by the way, I am in favor of massive government intervention to redress inequality, but I don't think that this pandemic tells us a whole lot about that. I mean, if your view is that government can never be of any use at all, then you should be having a reality check right now, because government action is clearly essential right now. And government, in many ways, it is, in fact, what we're trying to do is address inequality, primarily the inequality of some people are much more directly affected by the pandemic than others, and we're trying to provide some compensation for that, some cushioning. But that turns out to interact with pre-existing inequality. On average, the people who are losing a livelihood are lower paid than those who are not. But it's something we would be doing anyways. But I think what we need to understand is that although the situation is unprecedented, the role of government here is actually pretty traditional. Think of this as, first of all, there's public health interventions, and we've been doing that since the 19th century. And second, it's disaster relief. It's really, and this is a long-established role of government. We believe that the government, almost everybody believes the government should step in when there's a hurricane, massive flooding, a natural disaster. And that's basically what's happening now. Large numbers of people are being hurt by a random disaster, and the government is stepping in to provide aid. So that it shouldn't really move your views very much. Unless you are a religious believer that government can never do anything right, it really shouldn't move your views very much.
And Paul, there are many people, particularly in the States, who seem to be suspicious of the fact that the state has intervened in this way, in the same ways they were suspicious when the state intervened in the global financial crisis. And they're going to want the state to get out of the way as quickly as possible as a kind of matter of ideological necessity. Yeah,
and that's where if you have that kind of ideological blinders on, then this is you should be having a problem with this, because if you find the whole notion of the government stepping in to help people in need under any conditions unacceptable, then you are basically saying, let's let people starve or die in the face of a pandemic. And so you should ask yourself, of course, if you're that kind of person, you're probably not the kind of person who asks yourself hard questions anyway. But if that's how you approach things, looking at this situation right now, you should be asking, if my ideology is calling upon me to do nothing, and calling upon the government to do nothing in times like this, then maybe there's something wrong with my ideology.
Okay, well, I guess the question we'll come back to later is, well, what about after the crisis and the role of the state in the economy then? But we'll come back to that in a moment, Paul, because I want to bring in Deirdre now. So, Paul, rather disappointingly for the organisers of this event, if they're expecting fireworks, has basically said, well, there's not much to see here, really. This is the state doing what you would expect the state to do. What do you think, Deirdre?
Well, I agree on the whole. I agree that if Canada invades Maine, as I can hardly sleep from the fear of the damn Canadians, I think the government, the federal government, should leap forward and draft people if necessary to fight the Canadians. Not wait until they've taken over all of the Northeast before reacting. And that's what the governments of Britain and the United States did. They waited until the virus was very well established. By contrast, many democratic countries like South Korea and New Zealand and Australia, and of all countries, Greece, have had remarkably few fatalities from this because they did the duty of any kind of state. I have some friends who are anarchists, who are actually anarchists. I'm not. I'm a liberal in the correct and international definition of the term. And if you're a complete anarchist, you are against any kind of government action. But I don't think the people you mentioned in the United States are coming out of an ideology. I mean, there are a few academics of my acquaintance who are anarchists, but mostly these people who are protesting the lockdown and want to, gather in large groups without any face masks to scream about it. They're just doing a kind of macho act, such as individual one, as I prefer to call him, engages in. And it's incoherent, it's not ideological. So I don't think a true liberal's ideology is much affected by all this. True, some authoritarian governments like Vietnam have done a good job, put it in quotation marks, but mainly the authoritarian countries, the Russian Federation in particular, and maybe China. We're not altogether sure whether China has done the good job it brags about. They've done it because it involves coercion. And of course, coercive governments are very good at coercing. But what's clear is that an ethical commitment to adult behavior, which is the core of liberalism, works. And that's what Boris Johnson and individual one should have done, but didn't.
Great, thank you. Grace, what do you make of how this may impact on people's attitudes to state intervention?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that is interesting actually, because it shows it brought to mind for me a quote from Lenin, who said that we should never confuse big capitalist states doing a lot of state intervention for socialist states, because they are two very, very different things. I think when I looked at this question, my initial response was, no, I thoroughly agree with Paul that had the state not stepped in to do all the things that it's been doing, then the impact on both individuals and society at large would have been much worse. But I think, the issue that we have now is that we have this false dichotomy between free marketeers and statists, between libertarians and social democrats, let's say, when actually, from a Marxist perspective, the view would be that capitalism is a holistic system. States create markets, and they do so in the interests of capital accumulation. And at the beginning of this crisis, the problem that we had was that, potentially, especially after the kind of 12 years of secular stagnation, which was associated with a global debt burden 3 times the size of world GDP, particular vulnerabilities in, for example, the corporate sector in both the US and the UK. There were a lot of both companies and individuals that potentially were on the verge of bankruptcy. The domino effect that can have within the rest of the financial system would have potentially been huge. So the state stepped in, again, just as it did after 2008, to clean up the mess effectively. And I think we have to, we can say on the one hand that was necessary to prevent larger harms from coming about. But I think we also have to think about, firstly, what kind of capitalism was being saved? And secondly, what are going to be the long-term implications of these continuous interventions to bail out a broken system? I think, a lot of the problems that we had prior to the coronavirus are only going to worsen as this crisis continues. I mean, in particular, we've had, over the last 30 years, this quite significant increase in market concentration in a lot of different industries. And now we're seeing this on steroids. Crises are always moments where the kind of Schumpeterian forces of creative destruction accelerate, and you see small businesses fail, they're bought up by larger businesses. But this is happening in a huge way today because of the massive cash piles that have been built up by some of the largest monopolies that have ever existed in history. And some of those big companies, particularly Amazon, and those other Netflix, those companies that are doing so well out of the crisis anyway, the big tech monopolies now constitute, well, this was, a week ago, the stat, so it could have changed, who knows, but they began to constitute a fifth of the S&P 500, which is a staggering level of concentration for those big companies. You're also seeing, as alongside that kind of monopolization and market concentration, which obviously is not good news for capitalism, the extension of this problem really of moral hazard, which is, yes, a kind of libertarian term, but it's true, that was created after the financial crisis, where effectively central banks are saying to investors, to companies that perhaps aren't even creditworthy, don't worry about it, you're going to have access to all the liquidity that you need. And actually, the state is even potentially stepping in and saying, we're going to support the junk bond market. We're going to start buying up all different kinds of equities, all different kinds of bonds, just to ensure financial stability, without really thinking about whether or not they're supporting a healthy economy. I think, we're going to end up in a situation where we basically have a kind of a version of state monopoly capitalism, which was a theory put forward by a number of early Marxists, who basically said that we'll get to a point in the history of capitalism where you have effectively planning of the economy going on. It's just completely undemocratic because it's taking place at the upper echelons of society as a small number of very powerful politicians, powerful central bankers, financiers, CEOs come together and effectively have such significant control over huge sections of the economy that they're able to say, this is what's going to happen, this is what's not going to happen. Central banks are effectively planning on the principle, if you were a business before the crisis, then you're going to exist after the crisis, right? Is that rational? Do we not want to use this moment to build a sustainable economy? Do we want to use this moment, if there is going to be government intervention, to say, right, in whose interests is that intervention taking place? So broadly, in answer to the question, I think there is this question we have to look at in whose interests is the state operating when it does these, big, expansive interventions? And is that the way that we want to run the economy? Or is there a better way to ensure democratic accountability over these processes that are kind of taking place all around us?
Well, that was great, Grace.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.